The Women in Dunes by Kobo Abe. Translated by Dale Saunders. Chapter 25. He would have to escape by passing through the village before the basket gangs began their work. Judging by experience, there should be about an hour left or, to be on the safe side, 45 minutes. The spit of the promontory, as if embracing the village, gradually curved in toward the land, reaching as far as the inlet on the east side and squeezing the village road into a single lane. There the sheer cliffs of the promontory ended in what seemed to be slightly elevated, washout dunes. If he went straight ahead, keeping the mist-shrouded lights of the village on his right, he could expect to come out just about where the cliffs stopped. It would be a little over a mile. And beyond that lay the outskirts of the village. He could not remember any houses, only occasional plots of peanuts here and there. If he could just get across the dunes, then it would probably be safe to walk down the road. At least the roadbed was red clay, and if he were to run with all his might, it would take him about 15 minutes to get to the highway. If he could get that far, then he would have won the game. Buses would be running, and people would be in their right minds. Thus, according to his calculations, he had 30 minutes to get through the village. What was bad about the sand was that one wasted strength, not because one's feet sank into it, but because there was no resistance. Running was most wasteful of all. Walking with long, careful steps would probably be more effective. And yet, the sand compensated for sucking away one's strength by deadening the sound of footsteps. It was good, at least, that he didn't have to worry about his footsteps being heard. Well, look where you're walking. It didn't really make any difference whether he fell or not, and he frequently would stumble on the little rises and hollows and sink to his knees. That was all right, but if by chance he were to fall into another sand hole, what in heaven's name would he do then? It was dark, and the sand stretched forever on in irregular undulations. There were waves within waves, and within the small ones there were many still smaller ridges and hollows. The lights of the village, on which he had made his fix, seldom came into his view, for they were screened off by the crests of the endless undulations. When he could not see the lights, he went on by instinct. His mistakes were always appallingly major. Perhaps it was because his feet turned irresistibly toward the higher places, unconsciously seeking the lights. Again he had made a mistake. It was more to the left. If he went on like this, he would end up by going straight into the village. Although he had crossed over 3 small hill-like dunes, the lights did not seem to be getting much nearer. It seemed as if he were circling around in the same place. Perspiration ran into his eyes. He paused and took a deep breath. He wondered whether the woman was awake yet. He also wondered what kind of reaction she would have when she did awake and realized that he was not there. No, she probably wouldn't realize it right away. She would doubtless suppose he was just relieving himself behind the house. Tonight she would be tired. She would be surprised she had slept until it was dark and would probably be barely able to get herself up. Then, finally, she would remember what had happened between them in the morning from the lingering warmth between her legs, still slightly painful and dry. She would smile bashfully as she groped for the lamp. But anyway, there was no reason for him to feel any obligation or responsibility for her smile. By his disappearance, she would lose only a fragment of her life, one that could be easily replaced by a radio or a mirror. "You're really a great help," she had said. "It's so different from when I was alone. I can take it easy in the mornings, and the work is finished at least 2 hours sooner. I think I'll ask the village association to give me some kind of extra work to do at home. I'll save the money. And someday, maybe I'll be able to buy a radio or a mirror or something." Radio and mirror, radio and mirror, as if all of human life could be expressed in those two things alone. Radios and mirrors do have a point in common. Both can connect one person with another. Maybe they reflect cravings that touch the core of our existence. All right, when he got home, he would buy a radio right away and send it off to her. He would put all the money he had into the best transistor on the market. But he couldn't promise the mirror so easily. A mirror would go bad here. The quicksilver on the back would peel off in half a year. Even the surface of the glass would get cloudy with the constant chafing of the sand in the air. Just like the mirror she had now, you looked in it with one eye, and you couldn't see your nose, and if you could see your nose, you couldn't see your mouth. No, it didn't matter to him how long it lasted. A mirror was different from a radio. For it to be a means of connection, she would first have to have somebody else there to see her. What use would a mirror be to someone who no longer could be seen? She would be feeling surprised about now. She'd prick up her ears. Wasn't he taking too long about his business? He certainly was. The rascal had been clever enough to get away. Would she set up a howl? He wondered. Would she collapse? Or would her eyes just dim with tears? Whatever she did, it was no longer his responsibility. He was the one who had refused to recognize the necessity for a mirror. It's a story I read someplace. Leaving home is all the fashion now. I thought it was because of bad living conditions, but that doesn't seem to be the only reason. They mentioned a middle-class farm family that had recently added land to its holdings, bought machinery, and was doing quite well when the eldest son suddenly left home. He was a quiet, hard-working young man, and his parents were completely puzzled. They didn't know why. In country villages, you have social obligations and reputation to think of, so there really must have been a reason for the heir of the family to have left home. Yes, certainly. An obligation is an obligation. Then, it appears that one of the relatives took the trouble to find the young man and hear his story. He wasn't living with a woman, and he didn't seem to be driven by debts or pleasure. There was no single concrete motive. Then whatever was the reason? And what the young man said made absolutely no sense at all. He seemed unable to explain it very well himself, beyond saying he just couldn't stand it any longer. There really are foolish people in the world, aren't there? But when you think about it, you can understand his feelings. When farmers increase their workable land, they have that much more to do. In the final analysis, there's no end to their labor, and they only wind up with more to do. However, the farmer at least has a return on his potatoes and rice. Compared with the farmer's work, shoveling away the sand is like trying to pile up rocks in the river of Hades, where the devils cart them off as fast as you throw them in. Well, what happens with the river of Hades in the end? Not a thing. It's an infernal punishment precisely because nothing happens. Well then, what happened to the son after that? He had planned the whole thing in advance and had probably even settled on a job beforehand. And then what did he do? Well, he went and took his job. And after that? Well, after that he probably got his pay on payday, and on Sundays I suppose he put on a clean shirt and went to the movies. And then, we'll never know unless we put the question to him directly, will we? And when he saved up some money, he probably bought himself a radio, didn't he? At last, he thought. He had finished his climbing, but he had come only halfway. No, that was wrong. It was already flat here. Where had the lights that he had fixed on gone to? He continued walking with a feeling of disbelief. The place where he stood was apparently the ridge of a rather high dune. Why ever couldn't he see the lights from here? A feeling of apprehension paralyzed his legs. Perhaps his previous laziness was the cause of his failure. He slid down the steep slope, heedless of the direction. It was an unexpectedly long ravine, not only deep but wide too. Many lines of rippling sand lay tangled and confused at the bottom. They troubled his judgment. Even so, he couldn't understand at all why the lights of the village were not visible. His margin of error was not more than a half-mile on either side of his line of advance. He may have missed his way, but it could not be serious. He wanted to go left, but perhaps because of his fear of the village, he also felt he should strike out boldly to the right in order to get nearer to the lights. Soon the mist would lift and the stars would come out. The quickest way, in effect, would be to climb up to any elevated place, regardless of where it was, and get the best perspective he could. Still, he couldn't understand. He did not understand at all the reason why the woman had to be so attached to that river of Hades. Love of home and obligation have meaning only if one stands to lose something by throwing them away. What in the world did she have to lose? Radio and mirror. Radio and mirror. Of course, he would send her a radio. But wouldn't it work out to the contrary that she would lose more than she would gain? For instance, there would be no ceremony of giving him a bath, which she liked so much. She always used to save water for washing him, even at the expense of the laundry. She would splash warm water between his legs and, quite as if she were doing it to herself, bend over squealing in laughter. There would not be another chance for her to laugh like that again. No, she shouldn't be under any misapprehension. From the beginning there had been no contract between him and her, and since there had been no contract there could be no breach of contract. Furthermore, he too was not completely untouched. For instance, the stink of the cheap sake that came once a week and seemed as if it had been squeezed from a compost heap, the flexing of the flesh on the inner side of her thighs where he could see the muscles standing out in ridges, the sense of shame and scraping away. With a finger he had wet in his mouth, the sand-like burnt rubber that had gathered on the dark lips of her vulva, and her bashful smile that had made these things appear more indecent. If he added them all up, they would come to quite a lot. Even if his involvement seemed unbelievable, it was nonetheless a fact. A man, more than a woman, tends to abandon himself to bits and pieces of things. When he thought about what the villagers had done, he realized that it would be almost impossible to calculate the harm he had suffered. The relationship between him and the woman was of little importance. He intended sometime to take a full measure of revenge on them. He hadn't yet decided what would be the worst. At first, he had thought of setting fire to the whole village, or putting poison in the wells, or laying a trap to lure them one by one into a hole in the sand. He had spurred himself on, whipping up his imagination by thinking up such direct measures. But now that he would have the opportunity of actually putting them into practice, he couldn't continue thinking such childish things. After all, the violence of a single person wouldn't amount to much. The only way was to make his complaint to the authorities. Even if he did, he was somewhat concerned as to how much of the cruel significance of the experience they would grasp. Well, for the time being, he would report it at least to the prefectural police. Yes, and then there was one more thing. Wait, what was that noise? He could no longer hear it. Maybe it had been his imagination. By the way, wherever had the lights of the village gone? Even though the land was uneven, it was really too absurd that they were nowhere to be seen. He could easily conceive that he had tended to swing to the left and, having veered too far in the direction of the promontory, was screened from the village by some high ridges. He could waste no time. He would strike out boldly to the right. Finally, there was one more thing he did not want her to forget. She had never been able to answer his question. It had been raining for 2 days. When it rained, the force of the sand slides increased, but there was much less flying sand. Since they had done a little extra work on the first day of rain, they had been able to take it easy on the next. Taking advantage of the first period of leisure in some time, he had determined to push on tenaciously with a project. He had decided he would try to get at the reason that kept her in the hole, and he would go about it with the same patience one has in picking at a scab left from some skin disease. His perseverance had surprised even himself. At first, she had cheerfully let the rain strike on her naked body, but at last she had been driven to the point of tears. Finally, she began to say something to the effect that she couldn't leave simply because of the remains of her child and her husband, who had been buried along with the chicken houses on the day of the typhoon. Well, that was understandable. It was quite rational of her, and he could even comprehend her reticence in not speaking to him about it until then. But anyway, he had decided to believe her. He at once determined on the following day to devote some of his sleeping time to looking for the remains. He had continued digging for 2 days at the place she had indicated, but he had not found even a trace of the chicken houses, to say nothing of any bones. Then she had pointed out another place. He could not find anything there either. And then she indicated still another. He had dug vainly in this way for 9 days, in 5 different places, and then she had begun to make excuses, looking as if she were about to begin crying again. She had said that the location of the house had evidently changed, shifted by the constant pressure of the sands. Or perhaps it might have been that the hole itself had shifted. She had also said that the chicken houses and the remains of her husband and child might well have been buried under the thick wall of sand that divided her house from her neighbor's, and that they might have moved into the neighbor's garden. It was theoretically possible, certainly. Her unhappy, beaten expression obviously showed that she hadn't meant to lie, but that she had had no intention of telling him from the very beginning. The remains, after all, were no more than an excuse. He had not had the strength to get angry. And then he had decided to leave off trying to figure out who was indebted to whom. She would certainly understand this, he thought, but what's that? He threw himself headlong to the ground. Everything had happened too quickly. He couldn't grasp the situation. Suddenly the village lay before him. He had apparently been walking straight toward the sandy promontory that was adjacent to it. At the instant the prospect opened before him, he found himself in the very center of the hamlet. Before he could collect his thoughts, a hostile barking sounded from a nearby brushwood fence and was picked up by one dog and then another. In the dark, a circle of white fangs pressed in upon him. He pulled out the rope with the shears, sprang up, and began to run. There was no choice. The only thing to do was to make a direct run for the village gates. Chapter 26. He ran. The houses, floating in the vague light of burning lamps, formed a maze of obstacles and passageways along the single path of his flight. He could taste the wind wheezing through his tightened throat like lukewarm rust. A desperate gamble on a sheet of thin glass that was already bent to the breaking point. The basket gangs had certainly left their houses already, but it was still too soon to expect them to have covered the distance to the seashore. In fact, he did not remember hearing the sounds of the three-wheeler. He could not possibly have missed the put-put of the crazy two-cylinder engine from at least a half-mile away. The situation was extremely serious. A black lump suddenly sprang out of the shadows. It was a fairly big dog, judging from its breathing. The dog, however, had evidently received no training in attack and had committed the blunder of barking just before it was about to sink its teeth in him. He lashed out with his rope, and the shears struck something. The dog let out a baleful howl and melted again into the shadows. Fortunately, it had only bitten into the cuff of his trousers. His legs slipped out from under him as he recoiled, and he turned a somersault as he fell. At once he was on his feet again and running. However, there was not just one dog, but apparently 5 or 6. Discouraged, perhaps, by the failure of the first, the others awaited their chance as they circled around him, barking. Maybe the squat red dog from the shack was urging them on from behind. Then he jumped over a mound of shells in an empty lot and ran between some narrow brushwood fences, cutting through a garden where straw was spread out to dry. At last he came out on a broad road. Only a little more and he would be out of the village. Just beside the road there was a small ditch. 2 children, who looked as if they were brother and sister, scrambled out. He noticed them too late. He did what he could to bring the rope around to the side, but it struck them and all 3 tumbled into the ditch. Something like a wooden pipe lay at the bottom, and the dull sound of splintering would accompany their fall. The children screamed. Damn! Why did they have to yell so loud? He pushed them away with all his strength and clambered out. And at that very instant the beams of 3 flashlights lined up, blocking his way. At the same time the alarm bell started to ring. The children were crying, the dogs were barking, and at every sound of the bell his heart jumped a beat. His pores opened, and 1,000 prickly little insects, like grains of rice, came crawling out. One of the flashlights seemed to be of a type that had an adjustable focus, and just when he thought the light was dwindling, it suddenly pierced him again like a white-hot needle. Should he try a frontal attack, kicking them aside as hard as he could? If he could just get across there, he would be outside the village. He might regret the tactic later, and then again he might not, but all depended on this instant. Come on. Don't hesitate. If he didn't seize the opportunity now, it would be too late. He couldn't count on a second chance. Even as he was thinking this, the flashlights, poised in a half circle around him, spread out to the left and the right and slowly approached him. He grasped the rope more firmly and knew he must move, but he only stood there with his toes biting into the soft ground, unable to come to any decision. The places between the flashlights were filled with the dark shadows of men, and that obscure shape by the side of the road, which at first looked like a hole, was certainly the three-wheeler. Even if he were successful in getting through, he would be caught from behind. In back of him, he could hear the steps of the children who had stopped crying, running away. Suddenly, a magnificent idea occurred to him. He would get the children and use them as a shield. By taking them hostage, he could stop the men from coming nearer. But when he turned to pursue them, he could see other lights waiting for him. The road behind had been cut off too. He recoiled and, gathering his strength, ran back along the way he had just come. His decision was a kind of reflex. He hoped to find some place where he could cut across the dune that lay adjacent to the promontory. The men from the village yelled as they ran after him. His knees felt weak, as if his joints had loosened. Perhaps he had been in too much of a hurry. But for the time being at least, he seemed to have taken them by surprise, and he was able to keep enough distance between him and them in order to turn around now and then to see where they were. How far had he come? He wondered. He had already run up and down several dunes. Yet the more he strained, the more he seemed to be running vainly, dreamily, in one place. But this was no time to reflect on efficiency. There was a taste of honey mixed with blood on the back of his tongue. He tried to spit it out, but the substance was too viscid. He put his finger in his mouth and scraped at it. The alarm was still ringing, but it was already far away and intermittent. The barking of the dogs, too, had become a peevish, distant chatter. It was his own breathing, like a file on metal. That was the disturbance he was aware of now. The three pursuing lights were still in a line, wavering up and down, and while they did not seem to be coming closer, neither did they seem to be getting any further away. It was just as hard for him to run away as it was for them to run after him. From now on, it was a question of endurance. But he could not be very optimistic about that. The strain had perhaps lasted too long. His mind suddenly seemed to buckle. In this moment of weakness, he even hoped his strength would give out and he would have done with the whole thing. The symptom was dangerous. Yet it was still well that he realized just how dangerous. His shoes were full of sand, and his toes began to hurt. Looking around, he perceived that his pursuers had fallen back to 7 or 8 yards behind him, on the right. Why had they gotten off the track like that? Perhaps they had tried too hard to avoid the slopes and had ended up by bungling the chase. Apparently, they were pretty tired too. The pursuer, they often say, tires more quickly than the pursued. He paused and hastily took off his shoes to run barefoot. He stuck them into his belt, since they would be a bother if he put them into his pocket. Recovering his spirits a little, he ran up a fairly steep slope in a single burst of speed. If things went like this, and he had a little luck, he might give them the slip yet. Although the moon had not risen, the countryside was splotched with faint patches of bright and dark from the starlight, and he could clearly distinguish the distant ridges. He seemed to be heading for the end of the promontory. Again, he felt the urge to bear to the left. As he was about to change direction, he was suddenly brought up short. If he changed, he would at once shorten the distance between his pursuers and himself. He was thunderstruck, aware for the first time of their plan. Their pursuit, which at first had seemed implausible, was in fact very well thought out. They were trying to push him in the direction of the sea. Without knowing it, he had been guided. When he thought about it now, he realized that the flashlights were meant precisely to let him know their positions. The way they kept their distance without coming near was certainly done on purpose. But it was still too soon to give up. He had heard that there was a way to climb up the cliffs somewhere, and if it turned out to be necessary, it would not be impossible to swim over to the back of the promontory. He thought of being caught and taken back. There was no room for hesitation. Abrupt descents followed long, gentle rises, abrupt rises, then long, gentle descents. One foot after another, one step added to the next, like stringing beads, patiently, patiently. Unnoticed, the alarm had ceased. He could no longer distinguish between the sounds of the wind and sea and the ringing in his ears. He ran up a hillock and looked around. The pursuers' lights had disappeared. He waited for a moment, but they did not reappear. Had he really gotten away? He wondered. His rising hope made his heart beat faster. If it were true, it was all the more reason he should not relax now. One more dash, on to the next rise. Suddenly it was hard to run. His legs felt strangely heavy. It was not only the feeling of heaviness. His legs had actually begun to sink. It was like being in snow, he thought, and by then he had sunk to his calves. Astonished, he pulled out one foot and the other sank quickly until he was knee-deep. What was happening? He had heard of sand that swallowed people up. He struggled, trying to extricate himself some way, but the more he struggled, the more deeply he sank. His two legs were already buried up to the thighs. So this was the trap. Their target had not been the sea at all, but here. They intended quite simply to liquidate him without even going to the trouble of capturing him. Liquidation indeed. Even a sleight-of-hand artist could not have done it more smoothly with his handkerchief. Another puff of wind and he would be completely gone. Even the best police dog would be helpless. The bastards didn't even have to show their faces anymore. They hadn't seen anything or heard anything. A stupid outsider had lost his way by himself and had vanished. They had managed the whole thing without soiling their hands in the slightest. Sinking, sinking. Soon he would be up to his waist. What in God's name could he do? If he could increase the area of contact with the sand, his body weight per square inch would be lighter, and perhaps he would be able to arrest the sinking somewhat. He flopped down, his arms spread out. However, it was already too late. He had intended to lie on his stomach, but the lower half of his body was now fixed vertically in the sand. It was impossible to keep his already exhausted hips at a right angle for any length of time. Unless one were a trained trapeze artist, sooner or later there would be a limit to this position. How dark it was. The whole world had closed its eyes and stopped its ears. No one would even turn around to look at his death spasms. Fear convulsed his throat and suddenly burst out. His jaw dropped open, and he gave an animal-like cry. Help! The stock expression. Well, let it be a stock expression. What was the use of individuality when one was on the point of death? He wanted to go on living under any circumstances, even if his life had no more individuality than a pea in a pod. Soon he would be up to his chest, to his chin, to his nose. Stop. This was enough. Help. Please. I'll promise anything. Please. Help. Please. At last he began to weep. At first his sobbing remained under control, but soon it changed to unrestrained bawling. He submitted to his fear with the horrible feeling that all was lost. There was no one to see him. It made no difference. It was too unfair that all this was actually happening without any of the formalities being observed. When a condemned criminal died, he at least left a record. He would yell as much as he wanted. Since no one was there to see, he might as well. And so, when voices called to him suddenly from behind, his surprise was all the more shattering. He was completely defeated. Even his feeling of shame vanished like the shriveled ash of a dragonfly's wing. Hey there, take hold of this. A long piece of board slid down to him and hit his side. A circle of light cut through the darkness and fell on the board. He twisted the disabled upper part of his body, entreating the men he felt were behind him. Pull me up with this rope, won't you? No. We can't pull you out as if you were a root. A laughing voice broke out behind him. He could not be sure, but there seemed to be 4 or 5 of them. Just hold on a little longer. We've sent for a shovel. Just put your elbows on that piece of wood and you'll be all right. He placed his elbows as he was told and cradled his head in his arms. His hair was soaked with perspiration. He felt no particular emotion except that he wanted to have done with this shameful situation as quickly as possible. Say there, you're lucky we followed you. This is a regular mush around here. Even the dogs stay away. You really were in danger. Lots of people have wandered in here without knowing it, and they've never come back. The place is a mountain cove. There's a lot of drifting. In winter, the snows blow over, and the sand over that. Then the snow comes again. This has been going on for about 100 years until it's become like a pile of thin crackers. At least that's what the old Union chief's second boy said, the one who went to school in town. It's interesting, isn't it? If you dig down to the bottom, you may find something valuable. Whatever was he telling him this for? He could stop talking so innocently any time, as if he didn't know the truth. It would be better if he would just show his colors. Or he would at least prefer to be left alone with his own tattered resignation. At length there was a commotion behind him. The shovel had evidently arrived. 3 men wearing boards attached to the soles of their shoes clumsily began to shovel around him in a wide circle. They stripped the sand away in layers. His dreams, desperation, shame, concern with appearances, all were buried under the sand. And so, he was completely unmoved when their hands touched his shoulders. If they had ordered him to, he would have dropped his trousers and defecated before their very eyes. The sky had grown lighter, and it looked as though the moon would soon rise. How would the woman welcome him back? It really made no difference to him anymore. Now he was nothing more than a punching bag to be knocked around. Chapter 27. A rope was passed under his arms, and like a piece of baggage, he was again lowered into the hole. No one said a word. It was as if they were at an interment. The hole was deep and dark. The moonlight enveloped the dune landscape in a silken light, making the footprints and the ripples of sand stand out like pleated glass. But the hole, refusing a role in the scenery, was pitch black. It didn't particularly bother him. He was so exhausted that merely raising his head to look at the moon made him feel dizzy and nauseated. The woman was a black splotch against the black. She walked with him as he went toward the bed, but for some reason he could not see her at all. No, it was not the woman alone. Everything around him was blurred. Even after he had fallen onto the bed, in his mind he was still running with all his might over the sands. Even in his dreaming he continued to run. But his sleep was light. The memory remained of the distant barking of the dogs, and he could hear the coming and going of the baskets. He was aware that the woman had come back from her work once during the night for something to eat, and that she had lit the lamp beside his pillow to eat by. He awoke completely when he got up for a drink of water. But still he did not have enough energy to go and help her. Having nothing to do, he lit the lamp again and absent-mindedly smoked a cigarette. A fat but agile spider began to circle around the lamp. It would be natural for a moth, but it was strange that a spider should be drawn by light. He was on the point of burning it with his cigarette, but he suddenly held back. It continued to circle around, quite precisely, within a radius of 7 to 10 inches, like the second hand of a watch. Or perhaps it was not a simple phototropic spider. He was watching it expectantly when a moth with dark gray wings, mottled with white and black crests, came fluttering along. Several times its enormous shadow was projected on the ceiling as it crashed against the lamp chimney. Then it perched on the metal handle, motionless. It was a strange moth despite its vulgar appearance. He touched his cigarette to its body. Its nerve centers were destroyed, and he flicked the writhing insect into the path of the spider. At once the expected drama began. Instantly the spider leapt, fixing himself to the still living victim. Then it began to circle again, dragging its now motionless booty with it. It seemed to be smacking its lips in anticipation of the juicy meal. He had not known there were spiders like this. How clever to use the lamp in place of a web. In a web it could only wait passively, but with the lamp it could engage its prey. However, a suitable light was the prerequisite of the method. It was impossible to get such a light naturally. It would not do to look for a forest fire or wander about under the moon. Could this be a new species of spider, then, that had developed its instincts by evolving with man? It wasn't a bad hypothesis. But, in that case, how could you explain the attraction of a moth for light? A moth is different from a spider, and lamplight can hardly be thought of as useful in maintaining the species. And yet the point was the same. Both phenomena had come about after man-made lights had come into being. The fact that moths did not all go flying off to the moon was irrefutable proof of it. It would be understandable if this were the habit of only one species of moth. But since it was common to moths of about 10,000 varieties, he could only assume that it was an immutable law. This crazy, blind beating of wings caused by man-made light, this irrational connection between spiders, moths, and light. If a law appeared without reason, like this, what could one believe in? He closed his eyes. Spots of light seemed to float before him. When he tried to catch them, They suddenly swirled rapidly and escaped him. They were like the shadows of beetles left on the sand. He was awakened by the woman sobbing. "What are you crying about?" The woman stood up hastily, trying to hide her embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I was just going to make you some tea." Her tearful voice puzzled him. Her back as she bent over, stirring the fire in the hearth, made her seem strangely jittery, and it was some time before he understood the meaning of it. He was slow, as if he were forcing his way through the musty pages of some book. Yet he was able to turn the pages. Suddenly he seemed so miserable that he was sorry for himself. "I have failed. Yes, I have really failed. But there hasn't been a single person who made it, not one." She spoke in an unsteady voice, but there was a certain strength in it, as if she were defending his failure. What pitiful tenderness! It would be too unfair if such tenderness were not rewarded. "Well, that's too bad. If I had been successful in escaping, I was thinking of sending you a radio." "A radio?" "I have been thinking about it for a long time." "Oh, no, you don't have to do that," the woman said, flustered, as if she were making an excuse. "If I work hard at my side jobs, I'll be able to buy it myself. If I bought it in installments, the down payment would be enough." "Well, that's right. You could if you bought it in installments." "When the water's hot, shall I wash your back?" Suddenly a sorrow the color of dawn welled up in him. They might as well lick each other's wounds. But they would lick forever, and the wounds would never heal, and in the end their tongues would be worn away. I didn't understand. But life isn't something one can understand, I suppose. There are all kinds of life, and sometimes the other side of the hill looks greener. What's hardest for me is not knowing what living like this will ever come to. But obviously you can never know, no matter what sort of life you live. Somehow I can't help but feel it would be better to have a little more to keep busy with. "Shall I wash you?" She spoke as if she were encouraging him. It was a soft, moving voice. He slowly began to unbutton his shirt and trousers. It was as if the sand had filled his whole skin. What was the other woman doing now? He wondered. What had happened before yesterday seemed like ages ago. The woman began to rub some soap on a wet cloth.